Something rare happened at Muirfield Village this week. Jack Nicklaus said exactly what he thinks, out loud, on the record. Asked about the PGA Tour's new schedule plans just days before the memorial, he gave reporters a one-line answer that's still echoing through the sport. "I'm not in favor of this," 4 words. And suddenly, everyone in golf is picking a side. Think about who's talking here. This isn't a random commentator or a disgruntled fan on social media. This is a man who helped invent the very structure the tour operates under today, standing in front of a microphone and telling the sport, in plain language, that its next chapter is being written wrong. By the time this video ends, you'll understand exactly why he said it, what tournament he used as proof, what happened when he finally sat down face-to-face with the man driving these changes, and why some insiders think this single moment could define the next 2 decades of professional golf. So here's the actual plan on the table. The PGA Tour is aiming to squeeze its entire calendar down into roughly a 6-month window by 2028. That means trimming the number of events, cutting down the weeks, and stacking everything around a small cluster of premium, high-visibility tournaments. Driving this overhaul is Brian Rolapp, the tour's newly installed commissioner, who spent his career in the NFL before making the jump to golf. His vision reportedly shrinks the tour from something like 34 weeks of competition down to somewhere around 20 total events, majors and postseason included. And the ambition doesn't end at trimming the schedule. Rolapp is also said to be exploring a split structure, an elite championship tier and a secondary challenger tier, with players moving up or down based on performance, essentially borrowing the promotion and relegation model used in European football leagues. Pause on that for a second. Golf, a sport rooted in courses with 50-plus years of history, in tournaments that generations of the same families have followed, potentially reshaped to resemble a football broadcast package or a soccer standings table. It's not hard to see the appeal from a business standpoint. A tighter, more predictable calendar means cleaner TV windows, easier marketing, and a product that's simpler to sell to networks and sponsors chasing guaranteed audiences. That's the same logic that's driven consolidation in almost every major sports league over the last decade. The question golf now faces is whether a sport this deeply tied to specific courses, specific communities, and specific decades-long traditions can absorb that kind of restructuring the same way a league built around interchangeable franchises can. Nicklaus didn't wait around to see how the theory plays out in practice. He pointed straight at a real current casualty, the Cognizant Classic, a tournament with deep ties to his own charitable foundation. Wedged between 4 other marquee events, he said it flat out, that tournament has 0 shot. 0 shot. Not a challenging slot. Not some scheduling friction. 0 shot from the guy who's watched this sport evolve for 6 decades. And it's worth sitting with why this particular tournament matters so much as an example. The Cognizant Classic isn't some fringe stop nobody's heard of. It's been part of the Florida swing for years. It's tied directly to Nicklaus's charitable work, and it represents exactly the kind of mid-tier event that gave up-and-coming players and regional golf communities a real stake in the tour. If an event with that kind of pedigree can get squeezed into irrelevance simply by its position on the calendar, it raises an uncomfortable question: how many other tournaments with similar histories are one bad scheduling slot away from the same fate? Before we go any further, I want your take. Do you side with Nicklaus here? Or do you think the tour has no choice but to evolve if it wants to stay competitive with other major sports leagues? Sound off in the comments. And if you're someone who actually wants to understand what's unfolding in this sport instead of just catching a highlight reel and scrolling past, subscribe. This channel is built for people who want the real story, not the surface-level version. Now let's actually unpack why Nicklaus is sounding this alarm, because his reasoning isn't just emotion talking, it's a domino effect. And once you see it laid out, it's hard to argue with. Look at the current run, Pebble Beach. Then the Los Angeles Stop, then the Cognizant Classic, then Bay Hill, then the Players' Championship. 5 heavyweight tournaments, one right after another. No player, not even the best-conditioned athletes on tour, can reasonably compete in all 5 without burning out. So they're forced to prioritize. And when players prioritize, they're not skipping Pebble Beach or the Players. Those events are untouchable, protected by prestige and prize money. Instead, they skip whatever's sandwiched in the middle, which, more often than not, is exactly the kind of tournament that's been part of the sport's fabric for decades but doesn't carry the same marketing weight as the newer, flashier stops. Nicklaus described this exact scenario himself. Players telling event organizers, in effect, I can only commit to 4 out of the 5. Something has to give. And once it gives, here's the chain reaction that follows, piece by piece. The tournament loses its top-tier field. Losing the field means losing viewership. Losing viewership spooks sponsors. Spooked sponsors pull their backing. And once the financial support disappears, the tournament loses its guaranteed spot on next year's calendar entirely. This isn't speculation dressed up as concern. It's the literal mechanism Nicklaus is warning everyone about, and by his account, it's already happening in real time, not some distant hypothetical. And it's bigger than one single tournament on one single weekend. It's about what a tightly packed calendar does to every tournament that isn't in the top handful. Nicklaus said it himself, cram too many marquee events too close together, and it becomes a genuine long-term problem for the health of the tour. There's also a second-order effect that rarely gets talked about in these conversations. What happens to the communities and local economies built around these mid-tier events? Host cities plan around tournament week. Hotels, restaurants, charities that rely on tournament proceeds, junior golf programs that get funding from the event. When a tournament quietly loses its field and its sponsors over a few seasons, it's not just a line on a schedule that disappears. It's real economic and community infrastructure that gets hollowed out along with it. That's part of what makes Nicklaus's warning land differently than a typical back-in-my-day complaint. He's not just talking about nostalgia, he's talking about a slow-motion collapse that's measurable in dollars and cities, not just sentiment. Here's where this stops being a debate about logistics and turns into something far more personal. Nicklaus never framed this as a simple disagreement. His actual words were, "I hate to see tournaments bunch too much together. Hate." That's not the language of someone weighing in on a business strategy. That's the language of someone watching a piece of his life's work get dismantled in front of him. Golf commentator Dan Rappaport captured the tension about as sharply as anyone has. His point, in essence, was that it has to be an incredibly uncomfortable position for Rolapp, someone who didn't come up through golf, to sit across from the sport's most iconic figure and be told, essentially, that the version of the tour Nicklaus spent 60 years building bears little resemblance to the version now being planned. That's really the entire conflict distilled down to one moment. Rolapp is calibrating for broadcast deals, global audiences, and staying relevant against the NFL, NBA, and every other entertainment product fighting for eyeballs. Nicklaus is defending something that was never meant to be optimized for a spreadsheet in the first place: history, continuity, and the well-being of the players themselves. And Nicklaus isn't a lone voice here either. Justin Thomas has publicly described the current stretch of tournaments as brutally tough on the field. Multiple pros have said outright they don't want to compete more than 3 consecutive weeks. This isn't just an aging legend being sentimental about the old days. Current active players are echoing the exact warning Nicklaus is raising. It's worth pointing out how unusual this alignment is. Legends from Nicklaus's generation and active tour pros in their 20s and 30s don't often find themselves on the same side of a structural debate. The incentives and priorities are usually too different. A guy who built his career and legacy under the old model has different concerns than a player currently grinding through a 25-tournament schedule trying to keep his card. But here, both groups are converging on the same core complaint. The human body and the human calendar both have limits, and a plan built primarily around broadcast windows and sponsor deals doesn't seem to be accounting for either one. Now here's the twist that elevates this from complaint to genuine power move. Nicklaus holds no formal seat on the tour's policy board. He has no official vote in how any of this gets decided. On paper, structurally, he has absolutely no authority over the outcome. And yet, he stood in front of a room full of reporters and said plainly, "I want to sit down with Brian and Jay and have that conversation." He didn't leave it open-ended either. He specified the exact day, Wednesday at Muirfield Village, right in the middle of his own tournament week. That's not a polite ask. That's a directive. And when Jack Nicklaus issues a directive like that, the tour responds. Both Brian Rolapp and Commissioner Jay Monahan showed up at Muirfield Village that Wednesday for the sit-down Nicklaus had called for, publicly on his own terms. Sit with that for a moment. Titles and org charts are one thing. But 6 decades of shaping a sport, and the kind of gravity that earns, is a completely different category of influence, one that, in this case, apparently outranks the actual chain of command. It's a dynamic that's almost impossible to replicate in most industries. Imagine a retired executive with no board seat and no equity stake publicly summoning a sitting CEO to a meeting, and the CEO actually showing up on the exact day and location specified, without pushback. That's essentially what happened here. It says something about how much of golf's actual authority still runs through reputation and history rather than through formal titles, even as the sport tries to modernize its business structure around exactly those kinds of titles and hierarchies. So what actually got said in that room? Nobody outside of it knows. No cameras were allowed in. Nothing was recorded. Just Nicklaus, Rolapp, and Monahan, behind closed doors, working through what might be the single biggest internal disagreement the tour has faced in its modern era. Afterward, reporters caught up with Nicklaus and asked him directly about the schedule changes. This time, his answer was completely different. He declined to comment. Sit with that contrast. One day, he's telling the world flatly that he's against the plan. The next day, after a private conversation, he has nothing to add at all. That's not a minor shift in tone, that's a complete reversal in posture within 24 hours. Maybe some kind of common ground got established. Maybe the disagreement runs even deeper than either side is willing to air publicly. There's no way to know for certain which it is. But when a man who's never been shy about sharing his opinion suddenly goes quiet, that silence tends to carry more weight than any statement could. There's a version of this story where Nicklaus walked out of that room feeling reassured, having gotten some kind of commitment about protecting legacy events. There's another version where he walked out having said everything he needed to say publicly already, and decided a second public battle wasn't worth having behind closed doors. Both versions are plausible. Both would explain the silence. And until either Nicklaus, Rolapp, or Monahan says more, golf fans are left to read the tea leaves, which, if anything, is exactly why this story has generated so much conversation this week. Here's where I land on all of this. Nicklaus has every right to be concerned. Take a season that's been carefully built over more than 50 years and compress it into a tight, broadcast-friendly window, and something inevitably gets sacrificed, usually the tournaments and the traditions that don't fit neatly into a highlight package built for a 30-second clip. At the same time, Rolapp's position isn't baseless either. Golf is competing for attention in a media landscape that looks nothing like it did even a decade ago, and standing still is rarely a real option when every other major sport is actively reshaping itself to hold audience attention. The environment Nicklaus built this tour inside of simply doesn't exist in the same form anymore. The real unanswered question, the one nobody has a clean answer for yet, is whether the PGA Tour can modernize its structure without gutting the exact qualities that made people fall in love with the sport to begin with. History suggests these transitions rarely happen cleanly. Leagues that chase efficiency and broadcast optimization tend to gain short-term attention and lose long-term texture. The smaller stories, the regional rivalries, the events that mean more to a local community than to a national television audience. Golf has managed to avoid that fate longer than most sports. Whether it can keep avoiding it under a schedule built primarily around 6 months of premium inventory is genuinely an open question. So I'll put the same question to you that I opened with: is Nicklaus right to draw this line, or is Rolapp doing precisely what golf needs to survive the next 20 years? Let me know in the comments. I genuinely read every single one. And if you stuck around this long, you're exactly who this channel exists for. No recycled highlights, no empty hot takes chasing clicks, just an honest look at where this sport is actually headed. Subscribe if that's what you're here for, and we'll catch you in the next one.